Unit 11, page 3. Today's lesson will be about what factors affect a population in terms of limiting its size. So let's think about what the basic needs of survival are for living things. Take a moment, write a couple ideas. What do you think all living things should need in terms of their very basic needs? Okay, so now that you have a couple ideas, maybe you came up with food or energy, some things that we had mentioned in previous lessons. The needs of living things are very, very basic in terms of all living plants, animals, bacteria, anything. If an ecosystem doesn't have these materials, the organism will die. Very simple. So the basic survival needs include sunlight. Remember that plants need to do photosynthesis and they also need heat, as well as animals need heat. Food, so plants make their own food through that photosynthesis process, but animals need to eat the food, either from other plants or from other animals. Air, animals need oxygen. Remember that plants need carbon dioxide and oxygen, but carbon dioxide to create their own oxygen for cell respiration. Water, to help all organisms function, as well as shelter, which could either be something natural, like their natural habitat, or something built out of materials like a bird's nest. There's a term that we use whenever the needs aren't met. We call this a limiting factor, and that just means it limits the organism. Most of the time, this means the organism either has to find a new location or will die. Any part of the non-living or abiotic environment that determines whether or not an organism can survive is called a limiting factor. Limiting factors include things like physical barriers, sunlight, water, temperature, and soil. Remember that these are all abiotic factors that are considered limiting factors. Anything that's biotic is actually part of the ecosystem, so that's a little bit different. So let's get into what each of these is and give an example. Physical barriers is anything physically there that would prevent an organism or an animal to be able to do what it needs to. For example, there's a black bear that lives in a tropical environment, and because of a stretch of water between certain islands, the mainland is actually a physical barrier. So it can only stay at its actual location and can't get between the different islands because of that water that's separating the locations. So even though the bear can swim a little bit, it's too far that it's actually not going to go to a new island. Sunlight is also a limiting factor. So if you remember anything about animals like turtles, they have to actually sit in the sun, also lizards are like this, in order to warm themselves up. So that's a limiting factor because if there's not enough sunlight and they're not warm enough, they could potentially die. Also, kelp requires sunlight to produce food. Kelp is just this aquatic plant. You see it in the picture at the bottom. And remember, plants need sunlight in order to do photosynthesis. Water is also another limiting factor, and things like frogs might need water in order to breed. So maybe they live on land during their lifetime, but very rarely they go to breed and they actually have to do that in water. So if they don't have water, they won't be able to reproduce and continue their population. Temperature. Remember that especially plants can only grow in certain temperatures. Animals have a little bit more ability to move out of the way, but plants can only stay really where they're at. So if it gets too cold or too hot, the plant might actually risk death. Soil, there's definitely different kinds of plants in different environments. You'll see cactus in a desert, whereas maybe you'll see a big pine tree in a forest with more rich soil. So the soil will affect what plants can grow and can't grow in different environments. So let's do 2 summary questions just to see how we would do here. Number 1, a gardener places a plant in a garden where there's a suitable amount of space and water, and suitable soil and temperature. The plant soon dies, however, because it is in the shade. What is the limiting factor for the success of this plant? You should be able to determine that the limiting factor is the amount of sunlight. If it's the shade that's affecting the plant and there's suitable space, water, soil, and temperature, it must be the sunlight that's preventing its growth. Number 2, logging companies are no longer allowed to remove trees that shade salmon streams. What limiting factor would exist for salmon if the trees were removed? So salmon are a fish, if you're not sure, and shading the streams allows them to survive. So they are basically stopping the loggers from removing those trees. If they did remove all the trees, what would be the limiting factor that might kill the salmon or affect the temperature? So again, this is sunlight or temperature, because the fish population require a certain temperature to maintain that homeostasis, and if they're not shaded, if the salmon are not in a water that's shaded, they could potentially die as well. Remember to check for your understanding, write 2 insightful questions and their answer in the boxes provided. Make sure that these are questions that you could ask someone to see their understanding of this lesson.